Tonight, I was just about to say that. So tonight, we are recording this webinar, and along with the slides, it will be posted at stopforeverwhip.org. And we're all here tonight to get help preparing our comments for next week's EPA public meetings on the DOE planned change request. And we're pleased to have Don Hancock from Southwest Research and Information Center as one of our speakers. Don has watchdog WIP since 1975, and dare I say, because he's too humble to say it, that he is probably the nation's top expert on nuclear waste and expert and WIP at this time. And our other speaker is Doug Meiklejohn, who is an attorney and an advocate with Conservation Voters New Mexico. He has more than 3 decades of experience advocating for communities and the environment in New Mexico, most of which he spent working with the New Mexico Environmental Law Center, which he founded in 1987. If you want to get in touch with either of these wonderful gentlemen later, they welcome emails, and Don's email is SRIC, Don at earthlink.net. And Doug's is Douglas@cvnm.org. So after their presentations, we'll have lots of time for questions and answers. To ask your questions, please raise your hand on the reactions button. My good friend Janet Greenwald from Citizens for Alternatives to Radioactive Dumping is going to help me keep a queue. Yes, Marcia, you have your hand up. Please unmute yourself. Please.
Okay. Could you please put the emails into the chat?
Yes, I will. Good suggestion. I'll do that in just a second. After their presentation, so lift your hand. Janet will help me keep a queue. And we will ask you to unmute. We will unmute you. We ask that you keep your questions short and to the point to fit in as much discussion as possible. After you've asked your question, please lower your hand so that we can see if you have a follow-up question later on and you re-raise it so we can see that. If you prefer, you may write your questions in the chat and I will be checking that as well. Please, we ask that you help us keep an atmosphere of kindness, respect, compassion, and empathy for one another in all our questions and all our comments. And speaking of respect, we would like to acknowledge that we are all present on the unceded lands of Indigenous peoples here in New Mexico and across the nation. And with all that, I think I covered everything I'm supposed to cover. Gentlemen, Don, Doug, are you ready?
Sure. Let's get started. Let's get further started, I guess I should say.
Thank you.
So as Robin said, we appreciate people's interest in WIP and the EPA process that's ongoing now. What we're going to cover briefly in the next few minutes are WIP's mission, how EPA fits in, and what I call EPA speak, and we'll explain that a little more. What EPA approved as WIP in 1998, what DOE wants changed now in 2024, the computer modeling basis for EPA's approval, and back in the beginning and now, why rulemaking is legally required and important. Then we're going to talk about some of the basic problems with WIP expansion that are specifically relevant to what EPA is considering, and then more specifically what you can do and what we suggest you tell EPA in addition to anything else you'd like to say to them, and the schedule going forward, some additional resources that you can use after this, and then the most important part, your questions and answers. So, WIP's mission. The Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. Pilot plant means it was supposed to be the first of multiple geologic repositories, not the only one. So it's always had a limited mission. Since the 1980s, DOE and the state of New Mexico negotiated provisions of the mission that were, many of which were then enacted in 1992, the WIPP Land Withdrawal Act that Congress passed. So WIPP is to safely dispose of some, not all, some of the waste from making nuclear weapons during the Cold War, what we call legacy waste. You can see on the map to the right the 20 plus DOE sites that have shipped waste to WIPP that have waste from the Cold War that WIPP is supposed to help clean up. There was always a limit on the volume, and this is a volume limit, 6.2 million cubic feet. And as you can see, the repository consists of buildings on the surface, originally 4 shafts from the surface to 2,150 feet, whereas you can see there are these what are called panels, 8 panels of 7 rooms apiece, where this 6.2 million cubic feet of waste was supposed to fit. The sort of vertical 4 drifts, 4 tunnels that you see between these were areas that, if necessary, could have also, the plan was, if necessary for a little more space, that's where the rest of the waste could go. So mentioned some waste, plutonium contaminated waste from making nuclear bombs, most of which is also mixed with toxic chemicals. So it's called transuranic or true mixed waste. How EPA fits in. So before WIPP could open, EPA had to establish disposal standards, and we'll talk more about those later, what requirements the repository had to meet, and then to certify before WIPP could open that WIPP did meet those disposal standards. EPA issued that certification on May 13th of 1998. WIPP actually started receiving waste in March of 1999, about 10 months later. And then each 5 years, based on a Department of Energy application, EPA is to certify that WIPP still complies with those disposal standards. And as you can see, that was done, it's been done 4 times so far in 2006, 2010, 2017, and 2022. And then further, other than through the recertification process, if DOE has changes, and you can see they're called plan changes, when DOE's plans change, they're supposed to get EPA's approval of those things. And that's why we're talking about this now, because earlier this year, DOE did submit a request for EPA to approve some of what we call WIPP expansion. And we'll talk some more about the details of that. Now, what I call EPA speak, and these are things that people sometimes don't like to listen to, but this terminology that are on this slide are things that you will hear next week. So I want to at least make sure people understand what the jargon is and sort of a little bit of understanding what it is. Performance assessment. So how Department of Energy shows that it complies with those disposal regulation is an analyzed computer process with computer models and calculations to estimate the cumulative releases of radionuclides from WIPP for 10,000 years after WIPP's closure. So this is very forward-looking. This is projecting far into the future. And we all can understand there's no certainty about the future. That's why it's a performance assessment. It's a computer modeling process. The way that modeling process is shown, the results of it are shown in what's called a CCDF, or a complementary cumulative distribution function. And we'll see a couple of those graphs later on. So what this does is represent the probabilities of what the releases will be, and will the releases exceed the radiation release levels from various processes and events that are analyzed. Notice not any and all situations that might happen in the future have to be analyzed. Certain ones have to be analyzed based on their estimated probabilities. So what did EPA approve in 1998? EPA approved, and on the left, you see that facility design that we looked at earlier of the panels, the surface facilities and the panels. The center of the slide is the figure in the DOE application in 1996 of what this would look like. So again, this figure to the top is north. So this is looking down at the underground facility. The north, west is obviously to the left, south is to the bottom, east. And so the waste, the 6.2 million cubic feet was all supposed to fit in to those panels. You can see 6.2 million cubic feet, that translates to 175,564 cubic meters. And also at the time of the original application, what was going to be disposed at WIPP by the closure date, then estimated to be at 2033, was 3.44 million curies of transuranic waste. The reason facility design is in red and the curies and enclosure dates are in red is, as we're going to see, those are among the major things that DOE now wants to change. So in 2024, we have a different facility design. You see kind of in the center here, the 8, 9, 10 panels in the center, the original design that we saw, and then moving west, almost a mile to the west of the center of the site, they're proposing these tunnels or drifts going west and panels 11 through 19. The specific request to EPA now is for panels 11 and 12, but EPA wanted them to describe what their overall future expansion plans were. And so they've told EPA, in addition to 11 and 12, further in the future, they'll want 7 more panels, 11 through 19 that you see there. They also import, they say, you know, the volume of waste, they'll still stay within that 6.2 million feet volume limit, but they want to substantially almost double the amount of curies to 6.51 million curies. And the closure date, rather than 2033, is at least 50 years into the future to 2083. So these are very substantial changes in our view, and we'll talk about some of the implications of that as well. Okay, I should have given you a warning. Sometimes on TV you get warnings of if there's going to be some terrible thing coming on. Well, these are 2 graphs. These are 2 of the CCDFs, the results of the computer analysis that Sandia National Labs does for WIPP. On the left, you see 1998, what EPA approved then. On the right, you see what DOE is proposing in 2024. And without going into a lot of detail about these things, we can talk about them more in the Q&A if people want to. You can see sort of on the upper right side of each of those graphs what the containment requirements, what the release limits that EPA set are. And as you can see, in both cases, EPA is saying their computer models all show they're well short of violating the standards. A couple of things I'll mention about the one on the right, however. It is moving closer to that violating the containment limits. And you also know the range of analysis they've done is much broader now than it was in 1998 because of the greater uncertainties in what DOE wants to do and what the computer analyses are. So with that, I will turn it over to Doug to talk about some of the legal issues that we're concerned about.
Thank you, Don. As Robin indicated, I'm Doug Meiklejohn. I am a lawyer. I work for Conservation Voters New Mexico. The EPA regulations that govern the EPA's consideration of a plan change request are set forth at 40 CFR 194.65. CFR is lawyer speak for Code of Federal Regulations. It's where all of the federal agency regulations are codified. And this particular regulation indicates that if any changes that are proposed depart significantly from the most recent compliance application, the agency, that is the EPA, will publish a notice of proposed rulemaking. The Department of Energy's proposed change request does include very significant changes. As Don indicated, the proposed plan change request would involve 2 entirely new panels at WIP, that is panels 11 and 12. It also indicates that there would be 16 different changes in computer models, assumptions, data, and waste inventory compared with the most recent recertification, which was done in 2019. And then it indicates as well that the Department of Energy is proposing both panels, new panels 13 through 19, and new types of waste. And on June 24th of this year, 13 organizations, including all of those in the Stop Forever WIP Coalition, sent a letter with a legal memorandum to the Environmental Protection Agency saying, these are the considerations and these are the reasons legally why you have to do a rulemaking. If you want that particular letter and the legal memorandum, please contact either Don or me, and we'll be glad to provide it to you. It's also available on the Stop Forever WIP Coalition website. Why a rulemaking is required? As I indicated, there are significant changes. How a rulemaking works. The Environmental Protection Agency issues a notice of rulemaking and proposes its decision either to approve, to deny, or modify the plan change request. There is an opportunity for public comments on that notice of proposed rulemaking. That notice of proposed rulemaking, by the way, is published in the Federal Register. And I know that, at least I hope that most of you don't spend your time reading the Federal Register. Some of us do read the Federal Register, and if there is a notice of proposed rulemaking, we certainly will get the word out about that. In response to a notice of proposed rulemaking, people can submit public comments. The Environmental Protection Agency must consider those and respond to them, and the EPA then would issue a final decision. And importantly, that final decision can be appealed to court. The rulemaking process, therefore, provides a more rigorous and comprehensive consideration of what the Department of Energy is proposing for expansion of the WIP facility, and the Environmental Protection Agency is more accountable because the decision can be appealed to a federal court. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Don.
So there are lots of problems with WIP expansion that Stop Forever WIP and others have been pointing out for a number of years. Some of them are directly applicable and are directly at issue in what EPA is considering, what DOE is proposed and EPA is considering. So these new types of waste that DOE is proposing substantially increase the volume that would go into the however many panels. About 25, in the current estimate with the plan change request with DOE's application, about 25% of the total volume of waste in WIP at the time of closure would be from new plutonium pit production at the Savannah River site in Los Alamos National Lab. This is new pit production for making new nuclear bombs. So this is definitely not Cold War legacy waste that needs to get cleaned up. This is plutonium, new plutonium pit production for new nuclear weapons that are proposed to be produced for the next 50 years. Because of that 50 years of production, they would need WIP to stay open for at least 50 years as well. This pit waste also would substantially increase the radioactivity in WIPP. I pointed out earlier the substantial increase in radioactivity projected by 2083. About 24.5% of the total radioactivity at that point would be from this new plutonium pit production. So again, none of this waste, none of that radioactivity was supposed to be coming to WIPP. In addition, the second major new type of waste that DOE is proposing to bring is what they call surplus plutonium waste. This is waste that in almost all cases has been in or still is in nuclear bombs. Most of it is at the Pantex plant near Amarillo, Texas. The plan would be to ship those pits to Los Alamos, where they would be turned in, as you can see in the picture to the right, oxidized, a powdered form, because pure plutonium is not what's supposed to go into WIPP. From doing this powdering at Los Alamos, the powdered plutonium then would be shipped back across the country from Los Alamos back through New Mexico and other states to the Savannah River site. The Savannah River site would use a classified material to dilute this plutonium oxide so that they say it would be able to be disposed of at WIPP, and then it would be shipped from the Savannah River site back to WIPP. You can see more than 40% of the total radioactivity in WIPP would be from that surplus plutonium by their current estimates. So another thing that's changed quite dramatically is when WIPP was originally sited in the 70s, it, like all geologic repositories, was supposed to be sited away from natural processes that could cause releases, think volcanoes, earthquakes, things like that, or human-caused things like drilling and mining. So in the 70s, the WIPP site was several miles away from active oil and gas production. By the 1996 DOE application, as you can see, there were starting to be oil and gas wells near the WIPP site. Now there are many more. There are actually more than 500 active oil and gas wells within 2.5 miles of the WIPP boundaries. I do want to point out that the scales are slightly different. On the left is the WIPP site, the 16 square miles of the WIPP site, and 1 square mile of additional area around the boundary. The right is the 16 square miles with a 2.5 mile barrier around. So this dramatically, in our view, increases the chances either in the short term or in the long term of releases from WIPP, either from drilling directly or drilling surrounding, things like fracking and horizontal drilling that could also affect the waste in the repository. Okay, enough of problems. We can certainly talk more about them in the questions and answers. What you can do. So thank you for joining tonight. A lot of this is aimed at what's happening next week. Next Wednesday, in a week from now exactly, EPA officials and DOE WIPP officials, Sandia officials will be in Santa Fe at the Hilton Santa Fe at Sandoval and Alameda. There will be 2 sessions EPA will be holding on these meetings. One is from 1 to 3, and that's considered a more technical meeting. It'll be a sort of a more roundtable kind of thing where people can talk about their technical questions and comments about the application, the computer models, things like that. Of course, if anybody can be there and participate or observe that, people will be able to make comments as well as ask questions there. But then in the evening, the 6 to 8 o'clock time is specifically designed, and we encourage people to set up the night meeting to make it easy for people to make comments on whatever they want to comment on. So we want to encourage people to do that. EPA also has established a written comment period until September 16th. There is a link here, and we'll have it later in the slideshow of how to submit written comments. Okay, well, what kind of comments? We will be telling members of Stop Forever WIPP Coalition will be telling, we encourage other people to say, as you've heard tonight, that the EPA must conduct a rulemaking proceeding. We've been telling them that for a while. We know that EPA's heard that, but it will be valuable for other people in the state to say, yes, you want a rulemaking as well. Also, we encourage people to talk about what your concerns, why you oppose WIP expansion. It does endanger workers. It endangers you. It endangers people along the transportation routes. And if DOE gets what they want for many decades longer than what WIP was supposed to be open. And then obviously, whatever other reasons you oppose WIP expansion or whatever other comments you have, you are certainly invited to say those things as well. Also, and one of the things I guess I want to emphasize is under the disposal standards that we talked about, EPA approves or not the certification, et cetera, because of the computer models, the processes, the performance assessment, the computer models that show whether it complies or not. Since DOE's, Sandia's computer models are saying it does comply, the likelihood EPA will say, okay, it does comply. We can talk about what it might take to get a different answer about that. But even if EPA does agree, they can, as they did in the original certification and continue to do, put conditions in. And we specifically want to hold up two conditions that DOE actually agreed to. As Robin mentioned, we had negotiations with DOE, the Environment Department, and other people last year on the state's renewal permit. Two of the conditions in that permit that DOE agreed to is to prioritize legacy waste, that Cold War waste to clean up sites, Los Alamos and other sites for panels 11 and especially for panel 12. And secondly, because if WIP is the only repository, whatever limits there might be established are very likely to be changed in the future unless there are another or more than one other repository. So the permit now requires for the first time for DOE to annually report on its progress for citing another repository in another state. EPA would be implicated in that as well, of course, as we've already talked about in terms of WIP. So we believe that EPA should be making that as a condition now if it does approve panels 11 and 12. Also, again, because the additional panels beyond 11, 12 would also be a significant change. And it could well be that DOE at that point will be talking about yet other new types of waste. So we believe it's appropriate for EPA to already decide if they approve 11 and 12, that should be done through a rulemaking, and any future panels that DOE applies for should also be approved only through a future rulemaking process. So we hope people will show up and talk to EPA and how to do that. So EPA's schedule actually is they're going to be in Carlsbad next Monday for one of these meetings from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. If people want to physically go to that, they can, but I'm presuming that most of us or all of us on the webinar tonight will want to participate in that virtually. You can do so. There is a link here to how you can register to virtually attend the Monday meeting. The Wednesday meetings that we've talked about, you can attend in person by just showing up. You do not have to register in advance to show up. If you want to attend virtually rather than in person, there are separate registration links. Again, you can see them here to register for the 1 to 3 o'clock time or for the 6 to 8 o'clock time. And again, as I earlier mentioned, there's also a written comment period that you can submit written comments to EPA through this link. Some other resources we've talked about, stopforeverwip.org. There are resources there about what we're doing about WIP expansion and related issues. EPA website has a specific section on WIP that includes details about the plan change request, including the DOE application, letters that EPA has submitted asking for additional information, DOE's responses to those information requests, and other kinds of things. The WIP website has, of course, lots of information about WIP, various aspects of WIP. And again, in terms of submitting comments to EPA, you can do that through their website as well. Well, enough of us talking. Now it's time for you to talk. So let's go to questions and answers that people may have. Or
Dawn.
questions, and if you have answers or comments, you can do that as well.
Yeah. So thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Doug. You know, I always learn so much from both of you. We do already have several questions from Willard Hunter. And the first is, what success is EPA having finding a new facility for this waste? Even before that, Willard asked, how has the 2014 kitty litter accident impacted the schedule of WIP? And then a question about reporting the additional repository, the schedule and reporting on that. And finally, who checks the SNL models?
Okay, so EPA is not in charge of finding other repositories. EPA is in charge of determining whether they comply with disposal regulations or not, and if they do, to certify them. So EPA's role for additional repository would be, as it's been with WIP, DOE is who has to proceed with the process of citing another repository. WIP or DOE has refused to do that. We've been asking them about that for years, and they have said, no, we're not doing that. We don't need to do that because there's still space in WIP. WIP's going to be open for a long time. So a lot of citizen organizations said that's not okay. We've asked DOE to do it. DOE hasn't done it. So we then asked the Environment Department as part of the renewal permit to put a provision in the permit that requires DOE now on an annual basis, starting toward the end of this year. DOE will decide when, but at least by the end of December, DOE will submit the first of those reports. It will have to continue to report a public report to the Environment Department on an annual basis. So we will be able to have some basis to judge whether they are seriously pursuing other repositories or not. So it's really up to DOE to do that, but the state, through the Environment Department permit, is now saying we're serious about this, DOE. We'd like EPA to also say, yeah, well, EPA would have some work to do if there's another repository underway. So we need to know that you're doing that, because we'll need to get funding from Congress and staff up and things like that as well. So EPA is implicated in that way, but EPA is not who decides whether there's whether DOE looks for another repository or not. Just a couple quick things on the other thing. The 2014, if you look carefully, there was a delay in the recertification after the 2014 accident, because EPA wanted to get some more information about whether the accident had any long-term implications, again, for 10,000 years out in the future after WIP closes. They ended up deciding it didn't, but that slowed down and delayed that particular recertification process. It certainly has impacted DOE, and a lot of DOE's rationale for panels 11 and 12 is to say, well, we can't use some of those original 8 panels that we told the state and we told EPA that we were going to use to fill up with transuranic waste, because a couple of panels at least are either contaminated or otherwise unusable. So that's why DOE likes to call panels 11 and 12 replacement panels for it. So, and that significant, not exclusively, but that's significantly caught because of the contamination in the underground. The question about Sandia, who's questioning or who's verifying Sandia's models is a really fundamental one. A lot of us like to talk about the computer models and the processes that's used in this EPA process as black boxes. The only folks that have the computer models to do the performance assessment historically and even now are Sandia National Lab as a contractor to DOE. What EPA does, EPA doesn't have the capability to do their own separate modeling. What they do historically, and probably will do this time, is to tell Sandia they need to make some adjustments in terms of what they've done in the certification and the recertifications and now in the plan change request to show some further results that EPA may not be sure have been adequately shown in what DOE does. But it's one of the difficulties in this regard about EPA's process. They are very dependent on what DOE tells them and what Sandia models for them. Let me stop there because I'm sure there are other questions.
Any hands? So, as Willard pointed out, not Saturday Night Live, but Sandia National Laboratories. We both got a little dyslexic there. So, Marcia, did you feel that Don already answered your second independent computer analysis adequately for you? Okay, great. I have another question from Willard. Can NMED shut down WIP if no new repository is found?
I will note that one of the people in the webinar tonight is Megan McLean from the Environment Department. So obviously I'm not speaking for the Environment Department. And if what I'm going to say, Megan wants to say something different, I want to totally give her the opportunity to do that if she wants to. Obviously, she doesn't have to do that. I think two things can be said about that. In the permit, in the renewal permit, NMED specifically put in a provision that they could shut WIP down if the mission volume requirements of WIP that are in the Congressional Land Withdrawal Act are changed. So EPA, NMED is saying, yes, that would be one of their bright lines. In terms of other things, I think it remains to be seen. I think both DOE and NMED would say, yes, NMED has the authority to shut down WIP. The NMED would have to have good reasons to shut down WIP. And as I say, the Environment Department has highlighted one reason in their mind. But they could shut WIP down for short periods of time, as they did for 3 years with the 2014 accident, or for longer periods of time if NMED feels like they are not in compliance with the permit or are going to be doing things that are not in compliance with the permit, and the only way to prevent that imminent endangerment is to prevent it from happening in the first place. I would also say, clearly it's possible for the Environmental Protection Agencies to shut down WIP as well. Certainly, if it feels like there's going to be a violation of the disposal standards, it should do that. And under the law, they would require DOE they could shut it down and require DOE to say what they're going to do to fix the problem. So yes, it can be done. One of the things, this gives me another opportunity, in addition to understanding that your audience next week, if you go to any of the EPA meetings, is EPA, but also another audience, and as you can see, Environment Department representative is here on our webinar tonight. Environment Department people are going to be involved as observers, at least, on the EPA meetings next week. State officials, the governor, and others can hear about, are people concerned about WIP expansion? What are they concerned about? So also remember that state officials in New Mexico are another audience in terms of comments that you might make.
Don't see any hands on the screen, but I have one more from the chat. And that is a concern. Many of us on tonight's webinar was at the Buffalo Thunder NNSA meeting. And only 17 people got to speak out of the probably 350 that were there. Do we know if more people are going to get to speak and how that will work on Wednesday, Monday or Wednesday?
Well, I guess I'll say two things about that. EPA has historically been very open to people commenting. As I say, we suggested that the Wednesday, well, EPA was going to do one session in Carlsbad, which they're doing, and one session in Santa Fe. And Stop Forever WIP group said, we don't think that's adequate. We think there's enough interest in Santa Fe that you should do two sessions so that more people will have a chance to speak. While the evening session, for example, is scheduled from 6 to 8, if it's 8 o'clock and there's still people who want to make comments or ask questions, EPA has assured us that, yes, they will keep the process going on. And so, I mean, I don't know how many people are going to want to speak, but I believe EPA will be more receptive to making sure that people do have an opportunity to speak. Of course, they'll say you can also submit written comments, but they know that a lot of people want to make oral comments. And so I believe they will give people an opportunity to do so. And as I say, if people can't be on Wednesday, but could be on Monday during the Carlsbad session, I believe they'll let people comment online as well as people in person there as well. So I don't control EPA. I don't speak for EPA. They have historically, and in terms of these meetings, they've given every indication that they do want to hear what people in New Mexico want to tell them.
Janet, I see two hands. Am I missing anybody? You're muted. Okay, John, I see your mouth saying John and Arla are next. And then I think Deborah.
Yes, thank you. This is John. The term transuranic waste, as I understand it, talks about what elements or isotopes are involved. It doesn't talk about the toxicity, the strength of those. So I have always assumed that it's trace amounts that have contaminated gloves and other wearing apparel, tools, etc. So my question is this: if surplus plutonium is adulterated and shipped from SRS to the WIP, will it meet the trace standard, or will it be significantly exceeding a trace standard?
So DOE says, of course, the reason they're doing this is they recognize that weapons grade plutonium-239 from bombs does not meet the WIP standard. So that's why they need to turn it into powder at Los Alamos so they can adulterate it at the Savannah River site, as we discussed. So DOE's view is that yes, they will then meet the WIP requirements. We think there are questions about that, EPA specifically, but also the Environment Department should be looking at before they are specifically approved. So that's one of these contentious issues. The thing that's not so there's a dispute about, whether this could be okay or not. What's not in dispute, which I pointed out, is that a very significant part of the radioactivity that would be in WIP, more than 40% in 2083, if DOE's plans go forward, more than 40% of all the radioactivity at that time would be from that surplus plutonium, none of which was supposed to be going into WIP. So, I think John, I would agree with you. I think there are significant questions. Right now, most of that discussion has been deferred for a while. DOE at one point was saying, you know, we're going to start doing a lot of this very soon. They've more recently said shipping waste from Pantex to Lanil and doing this, what they call dilute and dispose of surplus plutonium, is delayed for maybe a decade or so. So it's not so imminent, but it still is their plans. And yes, I certainly, and I think other people in Stop Forever WIP are going to be highlighting this issue to EPA. We have already talked to NMED about it. We'll continue to do so.
So lastly, Don, could you please repeat? I think you said there's 500 active oil and gas wells. And did you say within 2.5 miles?
Within 2.5 miles of the boundary of the WIP site. So it's
Thank you.
not, you know, they're within the bounds of the WIP site. The Congress, when they passed the Land Withdrawal Act, said, and even before that, there were requirements that the oil and gas leases on the WIP site were all invalidated. So there couldn't be oil and gas drilling within the 16 square mile of the WIP site. But DOE only controls the 16 square miles. So everything around it is not controlled by DOE. It is open for oil and gas leasing, and there are lots of leases. There are more than 500 wells operating now within 2.5 miles. There will be more wells. That number is increasing. Not just the WIP site, but the whole area, the Delaware Basin and the broader Permian Basin in southeastern New Mexico and West Texas, is the leading oil and gas production area in the country now, and probably is going to be for some period of time. So this threat to the integrity of the site is only going to be growing, in my view. Let me stop. We have lots of other questions.
We do. So I have in the queue, just for everybody's, you know, FYI, first Deborah, then Savannah Woods, then Marcia, then Penny Maines, and then Willard Hunter from the chat. So first, why don't you go, Deborah?
Well, it's my understanding that Sandia has characterized or modeled the geology in the western area where they want to do the expansion, and that they feel that this is all great and it'll be really a good place to put these things, but that in reading what EPA said in their sort of critique of the plan change request, it seemed that there were a lot of unknowns still, that there's a lot of conclusions that are really only 50-50. And I'm wondering how good the characterization of that area actually is compared to what was done for the original WIP site, which took years to characterize. And also, do they really know where the pressurized brine reservoir underneath WIP is in the western area? Is it present there? Is that going to make WIP more at risk by putting it more of the repository over this pressurized brine reservoir that could move to bring all of this radioactivity to the surface? And that, I think I had a question in there.
Well, I think all of those concerns, Deborah, are things that can and should be discussed next week. I think, and Sandia, so for example, the Sandia people who've done that characterization are supposed to be present next week, so they can be asked those kinds of questions in, you know, particularly in the afternoon session, I think. So I encourage people to do that. I believe what Sandia generally is going to say is they're pretty confident about the characterization about panels 11 and 12, because they have done, there is a fifth shaft has now been drilled in the area west, in just north of, but in part of that western area. And they found in sinking that shaft that the geology, the hydrology, the stratigraphic formations were very similar to what they've seen. So they don't have as much concern. I think everybody would agree, including the Sandia folks, but again, they'll speak for themselves, that they haven't done as much characterization going west, as I say, almost a mile west, considerably farther west than they've been. So I think those are concerns that people have. Whether EPA is going to say those concerns are enough to keep them from approving 11 and 12 remains to be seen, but these kinds of things are technical issues that can also be discussed to say that before DOE could get approval of anything further west than 12, they would have to do much more significant characterization. Just for people who don't know, as Deborah does, when she talks about brine reservoirs and pressurized brine, it is proven within the bounds of the WIP site, actually a mile within the bounds of the site, but a mile directly north of the center of the site at a drill hole called WIP 12, there is pressurized brine. And by that means, if you drill into it, there's enough fluid under pressure that it flows without pumping, without any drilling, without any artificial drilling. It flows to the surface and created what we called in the late 70s Lake WIP. And there are other pressurized brine reservoirs in the vicinity of WIP. Those do have to be reported on an annual basis by DOE in terms of what they're finding and what oil and gas companies doing drilling around are finding. But again, there isn't drilling now allowed within the bounds of the WIP site. So as Deborah says, there are reasons to believe there could be pressurized brine actually very near or even underneath where these panels 13 through 19 might be.
How about going to Savannah Woods next? Savannah, you might have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys could provide like a template for writing public comment, because I'm probably not going to be able to do my own research. So just having something to work off of would be nice.
Okay. Thank you. We'll try and do that and get that up on our website for you. There are, if you look on our website, there's newsletter number 3, which gives you specific, in number 2, you have 4 talking points that you can use. And in newsletter number 3, you have specifics about the risks that we face, and you can just cut and paste those right out of the newsletter, but we'll put something together for you.
Okay, thank you. And also, could someone send the details to the Monday meeting in the chat, please?
Yeah. Let's go to Marcia next.
Yes, thank you. I'm kind of following up on Savannah. You know, I wonder, I've gone to a couple of meetings, public meetings, and I, as a member of the public, am not a nuclear scientist, nor am I part of I don't have the brotherhood or sisterhood language of that discipline. And I think it would be very helpful, and tell me if I'm wrong, if there's some kind of educational materials that can be given eventually to people like us who are on this meeting, who are not part of that complex, about the terms of, you know, what are used on a continual basis and in reports that describe toxic waste and their the ratio of toxic waste to the human body. So when we're looking at atomic material, and it has been degraded such that it's not as toxic, I guess. I'd like to know what that actually means. So just something that would clarify the science in a simple way for the public. And the second question I have, and I've read different things that indicate that there's only one site for nuclear storage for atomic waste from I guess, military use. And that's in New Mexico. Is that correct? Is there only one storage facility for nuclear waste?
So if we distinguish storage and disposal, there were about, as I mentioned, and we showed a little bit in the map on the mission slide, there are about 20 sites that when WIP opened in the late 90s had waste from making nuclear weapons. And so those are the sites that have what we've called Cold War legacy waste, what is called Cold War legacy waste, to bring to WIP. WIP was supposed to be the first, its name is Pilot Plant, it was supposed to be the first of several geologic repositories. Actually, today as we speak, the only deep geologic repository, in other words, 1,000 meters or so, or 1,000 feet or so deep underground. The only operating geologic repository in the world, not just in the United States, in the world is WIP.
Okay, that's
There are other nations that are proceeding with trying to develop repositories for their more toxic, more highly radioactive waste, what we typically call either spent fuel, irradiated fuel, high-level waste in the United States, high radioactivity waste in much of the rest of the world. So the idea of putting this very long-lived, thousands of years long-lived radiation someplace to keep it away from most of the environment and most people is deep geologic disposal. WIP was supposed to be the first site, and there were supposed to be others, but for a variety of reasons that we don't necessarily need to go into tonight, none of those other sites are moving forward. And DOE has taken the sort of lazy position that, okay, WIP still has space. WIP is about out of the original space in terms of those 8 panels that we talked about, but we're going to be able to get more space in WIP, so we'll be able to put more waste there. So there's no reason to do other repositories. We disagree. The state of New Mexico has concerns. Actually, people in other places have concerns because they know there are reasons that not everything can go into WIP. So yes, that needs to be done. And that's a thing that the Department of Energy needs to decide to do.
One last caveat to these questions, and that is, how was a pilot determined? A pilot project does not mean a permanent site. It means
Thank
the
you very
opposite.
much. Thank you very much. Again, without going into too much detail, the original authorization for WIP in 1979 by Congress said that WIP was to demonstrate the safe disposal of radioactive waste. Didn't specify exactly what the demonstration was, whether the demonstration was some period of time and then the waste would be pulled out and shipped someplace else, or whether some amount of waste would be there. As I mentioned, it was in the 80s and up to early 90s that what some of those further limits were going to be. DOE's position is Pilot Plant has always meant that it was going to be a permanent disposal site and not just temporary storage. But it was going to be smaller than a bigger thing that was going to come about. They have never wanted to change the name or never, for whatever reason, changed the name of WIP. But as I say, at this point in time, their plans are, if you look at their plans in detail, the only repository they have in their plans through 2083 is WIP. So that's why we in New Mexico are saying that's not okay. That's not what we agreed to. That's not what the law says. That's not what the consultation cooperation agreement says. That's not what the WIP permit says. That's in fact not what EPA said when they approved WIP in 1998. So, but somebody needs to hold DOE to account. If DOE is able to keep putting waste into WIP, they'll keep putting waste into WIP until we're able to stop them. So that's why we're calling on EPA, we're calling on the state of New Mexico to take action.
Cindy, I see you want to speak,
Yeah.
but I want to go to Penny because her question in the chat relates to what we've just been talking about. And that was, when WIP was originally opened, what assurance did DOE or other government agencies give New Mexico residents that WIP would close in 2024 and be a pilot project?
Well, let Cindy talk about that. She
You're
knows how to talk
muted.
about that. She wants to talk about something else, I think,
Yeah,
but go ahead.
okay. So go ahead, Dawn. Do you want to just give Penny a quick answer or a good answer?
I would,
And then we'll go to
I
Cindy.
would say the two clearly legal requirements are the state of New Mexico and DOE signed this consultation and cooperation agreement. Originally in 1981, it was last amended in 1987, that put limits agreed upon. DOE agreed with the state of New Mexico, these would be limits for WIP. Most of those limits, several of those limits were then enshrined 5 years later in the federal law, the WIP Land Withdrawal Act. Some of them were enshrined in the 1998 EPA certification, and some others were enshrined in the 1999 original WIP state permit. So there have been multiple things. The thing for people to remember, however, contracts, agreements, and laws, guess what? Can be changed. And so DOE, in a lot of people's views, have not lived up to their agreements. And may not live up to some of the agreements they're making now, which is why we want the Environment Department to enforce if they don't live up to provisions of the 2023 permit. But New Mexico has other means at its disposal if they want to use them, which is why we want people to speak to state officials, particularly the governor, and other officials about the concerns. DOE would say, yes, we gave assurances, but we also had caveats that things could change. And from DOE's standpoint, the 2014 accident that Willard mentioned earlier on made a significant change. It shut the facility down for 3 years, which delayed the process for getting waste in the ground. It contaminated some of the area, which means they need more space now than what they originally thought they would need, et cetera, et cetera.
Peter's been waiting really patiently. He wants to know if, even though he's in Vermont, are his comments welcome next week?
Yes, Peter. EPA is a federal agency. They have to listen to people's comments anyplace. So you are
Thanks.
certainly welcome, assuming you aren't going to physically come, but you can make comments either on the Zoom links or submit written comments. We would appreciate you doing that.
And
That's my
Cindy-
plan. Thank you.
Cindy, I'm gonna hold off on you one more second because Stacy came in before that, and let me find Stacy's question. Oh, where is she? Is fracking happening within the 2-mile boundary area at WIP also?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, simple answer. Okay, Cindy, take it away.
The only thing I wanted to do, Robin, was just address Marcia's first question. And that's why I was kind of trying to get in there. It's not that I wanted to jump ahead of people. Marcia, you had said that you had asked if there was a presentation or something where things were kind of simplified for the public, people who were coming into this new, and there's a presentation. In fact, there's two, both Deborah, who's got her hand up there, and I have made 2 different ones. And I've presented mine probably 40 times, and including to one of the committees at the state legislature, and would be happy to do it to anybody who would like to see it. Anybody on this call, or if you know other people who'd be interested, just let me know.
And Cindy does these presentations in person and on Zoom. So, and Deborah does as well. So.
That's
So-
all I wanted to do. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Cindy. I just am trying to give everybody their
Sure.
chance. Willard, I'll go to Willard and then Deborah, And Willard's question is, where is this high-level radioactive waste stored? And will Hancock waste come to WIP?
I think he means Hanford waste, probably, I
Hanford,
hope.
right, Willard? I was thinking like Hancock, Vermont, or Hancock, which Hancock?
Okay, so again, without going into too much detail, there is high-level waste that was generated from making nuclear bombs during the Cold War. That high-level waste is currently stored primarily at Hanford, Washington, and Savannah River Site in South Carolina. There is a significant lesser amount at the Idaho National Lab in Idaho. All of that waste is not supposed to come to WIP. DOE at various times has proposed sending some of that high-level waste to WIP. The state has always said no. I mean, we've said no, citizen groups have said no, the state has said no to that. But remember, in terms of radioactivity, back to Marcia's question about toxicity, the major toxicity of our radioactive waste in this country comes from commercial nuclear power plants. Historically, there have been over 100 plants that have operated. There are currently 90 operating. So in terms of radioactivity, more than almost 95% of all the radioactivity that's been created in what we would call nuclear waste, from commercial nuclear waste and military nuclear waste, 95% of the radioactivity is in commercial nuclear power plants. And that is almost totally, a couple of exceptions, but almost all of that power plant radioactivity is stored at the power plants. Some people in New Mexico know that there was a proposal by Holtec to bring a lot of that commercial waste to New Mexico, not for geologic disposal at WIP, but to put it on the surface of the site near WIP. That is currently on hold because of legal challenges and state laws. But WIP is only talking about a very small amount of the military waste from the Cold War, which is a very, very, very much smaller amount than commercial nuclear power. And of course, every day we have about 90 nuclear power plants in the United States creating more nuclear waste, as well as electricity.
So Stacy has a quick follow-up, or I don't know how quick it is, Dawn, but can't fracking activity compromise waste containment?
We would say yes, and people, geologists, smarter, I'm not a geologist, smart geologists say yes, it can. Well, so far, what DOE has said, and again, it's a question that can be talked about next week or thereafter. DOE's position up to now has been that the fracking is about 3,000 to 6,000 feet below, further deeper than where the waste is. So DOE's position is that if there was any impacts of the fracking, it wouldn't actually affect the waste because the fracking is at a lower level outside of the boundaries of the site, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been their historic position. There's increasing evidence that fracking causes faulting, not just at the level of the fracking's happening, but at other levels. So that would be a concern. There also is a historic scenario, a historic well back 40 years ago at the Hartman site, which is 40 miles or so from WIP, where early years of fracking had the fracking liquids escaping and moving horizontally at a higher level, not at the level they were supposed to be going out to fracking. So the argument, of course, is, well, if that happened one time, that could happen other times. And some of these fracking wells close to the WIP site could actually have excursions, as they like to call it, could affect actually the repository levels or levels close to it. So this is this is a very much legitimate question. It is a very much in dispute question. And I think you will find some geologists that say one thing and some say another, and the fact is nobody knows for sure.
So Deborah, I'm sorry to put you off yet again, but Allison's follow-up is, Stacy says, fracking has caused many earthquakes in Texas and Oklahoma. And I think we've had minor ones in southeastern New Mexico, fairly near the website as well. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but Allison has a really interesting also comment, and that is it possible that some of the pressurized brine spoken of earlier near the website could come to the surface contaminated with plutonium? And if so, how would the contamination be mitigated or contained?
Yes, is the short answer to the question. Again, without going, EPA will tell you, and there probably will be some discussion next week, that among the scenarios that EPA has DOE modeling is a scenario in which there is drilling into waste at the WIPP site. DOE and EPA would argue, yes, we've modeled that. The amount of waste that would be released is less than what the disposal regulations allow. And so, that's why we continue to say that WIPP shows compliance. There are lots of assumptions that go into that. The state of New Mexico, Southwest Research and Information Center, and CARD all challenged the original certification in 1998 that EPA issued, in part because of the testimony of arguably the father of a lot of hydrogeologic modeling, Dr. John Bredehoff, who did some looking at WIPP and some modeling of WIPP, in which he said certain scenarios of air drilling, a different kind of drilling than what's normally used for oil and gas, could have much higher levels of releases than what DOE was modeling and EPA said was reasonable. DOE, of course, rejected and continues to reject, even in this plan change request. They go into a whole discussion. DOE goes into a whole discussion about why they're still not considering these air drilling scenarios and releases from that. But it is a contested point. We contested it back in 1998. The court, in making their decision upholding the certification, deferred to the expertise of DOE and EPA as opposed to other folks. But yes, for more than 25 years, this has been a contested issue.
So it sounds like DOE is willing to take that fracking risk, and that the DOE has priority over EPA. Is that, or how would you characterize that as sort of a question from Willard?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different answers to that. As I say, EPA has the authority, clearly has the authority under the law and under their regulations to shut down WIPP if they think it does or could or would violate the disposal regulations, or even if it violates shorter term radiation protection requirements that EPA has. So they clearly have the authority to do that. There is a lot of political pressure from DOE and other folks. There would be a lot of pressure if EPA was thinking about doing that for EPA not to do that. But yes, it's uncontested. They have authority to say no WIPP can be shut down.
Deborah, thank you for your patience, my friend. Go for it, girl.
Well, I actually just wanted to go way back to Marcia's question about information about different issues, and if you're interested in the geology or the characterization, the original CARD website, which is some of which is quite out of date now, but the geology is still pretty sound on there. And there's a technical and non-technical section. There's a discussion about the site, and it's pretty detailed. So if you really want to delve into geology and characterization, it's cardnm.org. So that's CARDNM.org. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Deborah. Peter wants to know if the Chevron decision means that judges now have the final word over agency experts.
That's a legal question for Doug.
All right.
Yeah, it's the Chevron, for those of you who are not familiar with the Chevron decision, it was a case involving Chevron Oil Company that was decided, I think it was a couple of decades ago, that indicated that judges should give deference to decisions made by agency people when the judges were considering whether or not to overrule or vacate decisions made by those agencies. The US Supreme Court recently decided that that was an incorrect decision and that Chevron deference is no longer required. I don't think we have enough history since the Supreme Court made that decision to know how that's going to play out. My own personal view is that judges in federal courts are likely to continue to give some deference, at least, to agency experts, just because those agency experts are experts in particular subject matters such as geology or transport of chemicals, much more than judges are experts in those areas. But as I say, that was a recent decision by the US Supreme Court, and I'm just not sure how that's going to play out at this point.
Interesting. So Penny wrote that at the session at Buffalo Thunder, she heard a statement that declared WIP a failure. Can you remind me of what that statement was? I'm not sure I remember that or who said that. Does anybody? Cindy's nodding. Yes, she remembers that. Go, Cindy. You're muted, hon.
I think it was something Dawn said, that WIP is a single point of failure. Is that what you were referring to, Penelope? Yeah, and because it's the only one of its kind, if things go wrong at WIP, then the entire structure kind of falls apart. But I'll let you take that, Dawn.
Oh, I could get on my hobby horse and talk a lot about that. Let me just say quickly a couple of things. One of the provisions of the WIP permit that DOE put into it and was very proud of, has been very proud of all along, was from DOE's standpoint, WIP was going to, their words, start clean, stay clean. Dangerous waste was going to come from the sites, be transported safely to WIP, be received on the surface, put underground in the repository, and there was never going to be any release on transportation or especially in the underground. WIP was going to operate perfectly. Well, I argued in writing on a number of occasions before 2014 that they hadn't fulfilled that standard. And certainly since 2014, DOE itself kind of has to admit that they haven't met that standard. There is contamination in the underground. There was contamination on the surface. On February 14th of 2014, there were 14 workers on the surface when the release happened, all of whom were contaminated with radioactivity. The next morning, that was Friday night, Saturday morning, other workers came to the surface. Nobody went underground or on the surface, and 8 more people got contaminated. There's no dispute about that. DOE itself agrees. 22 people on the surface were contaminated. So that's not starting clean and staying clean. There are several thousand miles of tunnels, actually, I'm sorry, yes, miles and thousands of feet of underground area that are contaminated with that were never supposed to be contaminated. So in that sense, it hasn't met its goal. It has, again, depending on how you want to count, something on the order of 60% of the amount of waste that was supposed to go into WIPP is in WIPP. So they've somewhat succeeded. As far as we know on the transportation standpoint, there have been no releases yet in terms of transportation. There have been some accidents, but no releases that we know of. So again, depending on your standard, if you have a start clean, stay clean standard, WIPP has failed. If you have is it continuing to operate, continuing to bring waste in, continuing to have waste underground, et cetera, the answer is, yeah, it's succeeding. It hasn't fulfilled that full mission that we talked about in terms of volume or radioactivity. So, but the point I was making to Secretary or Administrator Harubi of the National Nuclear Security Administration was not a point that I'm particularly the only one making. More importantly, the National Academy of Sciences in their 2020 report made the point that there are lots of questions about whether WIPP will work for this surplus plutonium that we talked about. And the NAS had numerous concerns and recommendations to DOE for dealing with that, most of which DOE has ignored. And so I was trying to remind Secretary Harubi of something that she would have to admit to, which she did. If there's only one repository and something goes wrong with it, she's got no place to put the rest of her waste.
Thank you.
So I'm reminded of something that Deborah reminds us all of often, that she heard DOE say, and I can't remember when, maybe she can clarify that, safety is a journey, right? So I don't know. Deborah, do you want to say a few words about that before I go to John?
Well, actually, yeah, I love this meme. The meme used to be, we've made some mistakes in the past, but now we know what we're doing. And they had that for quite a few years. And then they switched after the accident, the explosion underground and release. They switched to, when they were asked how the safety culture was going at WIPP, this was about a year later, and this is when I first heard it, and they said, well, safety is a journey, and we're on that safety journey. And so just about they continue to use this meme, and about a year ago or so, I can't remember who it was some official at LANL who said, not only is safety a journey, but the destination isn't important. So I think they're saying that because they're down a dead end at night without a flashlight or a map, and they don't know where they're going when it comes to safety. But yeah. Mhm.
John's got his hand up. Robin, are you frozen? Since you look like you may be.
I think she.
John, why don't you go ahead? But you need to unmute yourself, John.
I've always wondered, we're talking about fixed site, but what if any jurisdictional authority does the EPA have over transportation when it relates to potential exposure, relates to plans that need to be reviewed to see if they're sufficient? Is EPA just only about fixed spaces, or can they get involved on this silly plan to move? We know we have to move nuclear waste to the WIPP, but this plan to move it from Texas to New Mexico to South Carolina to New Mexico. Can they weigh in on any of that?
I don't know whether Doug wants to speak to EPA's legal authorities or not. I'll let him go if he wants to.
I think EPA does have authority in the context of dealing with the entire operation of WIP and some of those other sites to consider risks posed by transportation. And I'm informed, Don, that Robin's computer just died. So I think that calling on people from now on is up to you and me.
Well, Janet can help too, but go ahead. So John, this is a perfectly good question to ask EPA next week when you have EPA officials from Washington who have authority and expertise to answer the question. Generally, they're going to say they don't have direct authority over transportation, and they have lots of different radiation regulations, but in general, they don't relate to transportation. Generally, DOE's transportation is quote unquote self-regulating, which means it's not regulated. It means DOE can do what it wants. Most commercial transportation falls under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations, or in some cases, U.S. Department of Transportation regulations. So where EPA clearly has, if EPA says WIP can't accept any more waste, that would be a decision that you can't transport more waste to WIP. So, in that sense, it can regulate by saying, don't bring any more to WIP. But in terms of the specific transportation things, not so much. But the reason we mentioned transportation in terms of risks is if WIP doesn't operate for very long, or it doesn't operate past 2033, kind of the original date for EPA, that would mean a lot less transportation than if WIP operates till 2083, 50 years more or beyond that. So, I mean, it doesn't take radiation science or rocket science to figure that out. And so it is relevant, I think, to tell EPA, if you're concerned about transportation, we're concerned about transportation. We're concerned about transportation going on forever and endangering us and future generations in New Mexico and in lots of other places along the transportation routes. And that EPA should take that into consideration in making its decision about WIP going forward.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Janet, you're muted if you're trying to speak.
I did put a question in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you, Penny. I
You-
wasn't looking. Maybe
that's
Janet
okay.
was. Inclusion of input from Pueblo people was an afterthought of Buffalo Thunder. Is there a way to ensure Indigenous people are given an opportunity for input earlier on August 28th? Well, John and Arla can specifically speak to that because they've made a specific request to EPA and have gotten a specific response to EPA on that subject.
Yeah, I was really heartened, and I acknowledged diplomatically back to the EPA that they, without any cajoling or pressure, readily accepted my request that if Native Americans were present and they chose to make a opening invocation, a prayer, that it would be allowed. They said absolutely, and I asked them if we could read a land acknowledgement at the outset of the session, and there again they said absolutely. So I think this is a historic accommodation that is just great, and it sure shows the difference between someone who wants to. In fact, the person came back and said, we want all of our stakeholders to be comfortable and feel included and and listened to. I'm pretty sure those were the words, and I thought that was really wonderful.
Thank you.
So yeah, as I tried to say earlier, the EPA people we're dealing with on this have in the past, they're sitting in Washington, D.C., so they're not hearing a lot from us. So point one. But point two, when they've come to New Mexico in the past, they have in fact genuinely wanted to hear what people have to say. So back to the earlier question, are 17 people going to get to speak and then they're going to get cut off and et cetera. I don't believe that is what EPA is going to do. As I say, I believe if people want to go still, you know, if at 8 o'clock there are still people who want to ask questions, make comments, I firmly believe the EPA people will stay and listen to them, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to characterize the EPA folks. I mean, I've said some things about, you know, how I think they think and rule about certain things, but I don't speak for them. But I think they've demonstrated historically, while they don't necessarily agree with things that we say or everything that we say, they are more willing to listen to us. I think the EPA people who are coming out are, you know, from Washington, are genuinely interested in what people have to say. So talk to them.
So in the chat, the question is, what lessons did we learn from the 2014 accident?
Oh, I guess I would say that's a big question. And I guess I would say it depends on who the we is. I guess the thing that I would highlight in relation to EPA is to remind EPA that what happened in 2014 was not supposed to happen. And there were releases that weren't supposed to happen. DOE and EPA both said that the level of releases in 2014 were not, I'm forgetting exactly the language, but in essence, didn't meet their regulatory requirements. They don't dispute, as I say, DOE doesn't dispute that 22 of its own workers were contaminated. There's no question about that. And we don't know what the health effects have been on those 22 workers. But you know, that part is clear. And so the point I would make is EPA, when you're thinking long term as what you are, you need to maybe rethink how much you can rely on some of these scenarios and probabilities that DOE is putting into their models, and maybe a number of them ought to be looked at. One of the things that I will be talking about next week is what Run Sandia has done to show that the standards would be violated. You know, one of the ways you can check computer models is, you know, to run them even beyond what you think is the right thing, so that you can have some further ability to judge, okay, what would it take to violate the standards? Is that you know, when we see what that would take, is that so unreasonable as what up to now we've thought it was? So so I think 2014 is a lesson in that regard. And I guess the other point I want to make, they have still not, 10 years later, they are still not shipping as much waste to WIPP on a weekly, monthly, annual basis as they were during the peak years before 2014. So there still are effects from 2014 being felt. Joni has her hand up, and Robin may be back. I thought I let Robin back in. There she is. Robin's back in. Go ahead, Joni.
Hi, folks. I This computer modeling situation is of concern in terms of EPA's reliance on the models. And I guess, has EPA ever required DOE to run the computer models to failure?
No,
Okay, and then, so with regard to the fracking issues around WIP, the new Produced Water Act allows for work. It's focused on allowing fracking water to remain on the oil fields. So the area around WIP is, I'm not saying this right, it's been a long day. Is the area around the 16 miles considered oil field?
I guess I'm not sure exactly what you're saying. There's not oil and gas production allowed within the 16 square mile site. The
Right.
area outside the 16 square mile site is generally open for leasing, whether it's state land or federal, mostly Bureau of Land Management land, is open for leasing, which is why there are more than 500 active wells, and there are additional sites that are leased, so additional wells can be put in. So yes, outside of the 16 square miles is definitely oil and gas areas. It's one of the most active producing oil and gas areas in the world, not just in the United States.
So then we could ask EPA or Sandia folks, how have you been taking, how has the computer or how has the model addressed the issues with regard to the increase in oil and gas activity around the WIP site?
Yes, and
Yeah.
they have some answers for that. They put some answers in writing to that, and what they've submitted to EPA. I would not argue that they have fully answered those questions. But again, those are totally good questions and comments to make either in the Wednesday afternoon session or otherwise.
Okay. And so just so that folks know, so on the EPA website, all of those documents are available. I'll try to put that in the. Or is it important?
Yeah, no, go ahead. You can do that. It was in the slide, but people can look at it. So Willard has a couple of things in the chat. How many minutes will be allowed? EPA has not yet set a number. My guess is they're going to say, if there are 100 people who want to speak, they're going to need to put some limits on them. I guess I would encourage people to come up with, your typical 3-minute kind of thing. But if you want to go longer than that, I think that's fine. Again, I think people just need to recognize if you want to speak for an hour and there are another 50 people speaking, that really isn't reasonable, and EPA is not going to let that happen. But I don't think EPA is going to want to set hard limits. If people want to make a 30-second comment, that's fine. If they want to make 3 or 4 minutes, I think that'll be fine. They haven't established a limit, and I don't think they will until they see better how many people want to speak and make comments. Willard's second question was, will the 22 workers, I presume, that were contaminated with be covered by RECA? The answer to that is no. They are covered by the Energy Employees Occupational Injury Compensation Program, which is a separate program which is specifically for workers at Department of Energy sites. So RECA, Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, is from downwinders, Nevada test site people, uranium ore haulers and transport workers, folks like that, not for Department of Energy employees.
And certainly it won't cover the downwinders in the Tularosa Basin at this point, I think.
Right now, RECA doesn't cover anybody because Congress didn't renew it.
Yeah.
And so the people who are already getting, have gotten financial compensation or are getting medical bills paid under RECA are still getting their bills paid, but no new people are being included in RECA, which is a separate problem that some of our brethren were demonstrating today in Las Cruces about with U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson, who was raising money in New Mexico, and a number of people were saying Speaker Johnson put RECA on the House floor. Separate issue, but in terms of related things that we are concerned about, there are lots of people in New Mexico who are not getting compensated and should be. Unrelated to what.
So Megan had her hand up briefly
Oh,
at the
I'm
beginning of
sorry.
the session. And I'm not sure whether that was a mistake or whether Megan has a question to ask.
There's
Hello.
Megan.
I didn't have my hand up, but thanks for being concerned. No, I just appreciate listening to all of this while I'm also making dinner for my kids. But I do appreciate everything you all are saying, and I'll be at both of the EPA meetings in Santa Fe and also online, and we'll be happy to answer questions at that time if something comes up.
And
So-
Megan, why don't you say 2 sentences more about what your job is and what your role is, so people know.
I'm an environmental scientist working in the WIP permitting group, which is
At
part
the-
of the Hazardous Waste Bureau at the New Mexico Environment Department. And we have authority over WIP through the Hazardous Waste Facility permit.
And we appreciate very much your involvement.
Well, I appreciate you all too. Thank you. Stakeholders are a key part of regulating a nuclear facility, and you all are a really important part of the process. Thank you.
And you were really important in the negotiations on the permit, Megan.
Thank
So
you.
thank you.
It was a pleasure to work with you, Robin.
And I just saw Joni has her hand up, and Janet, you've been on the whole time, so you might have people I missed now that you're unmuted.
Oh, I put up, I clap my hands,
Okay.
Robin, for that Megan is on the call and that she had comments. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joni.
And read the chat. Penny has something in the chat. DOE's wanting to expand and extend WIP is a continuation of racism towards New Mexico and colonization. Could we ask at the 1 p.m. session what education and training staff at EPA and DOE have done on racism awareness and the history of colonization in New Mexico?
And the answer to that is, of course, you can ask that question.
And John and Arla, I would encourage you to wear your Plutonium Trail t-shirts for sure.
I think you can wear what you want to.
So, may I respond to Penny?
Yes, please.
So Penny, I think it's really important to talk about these issues because for the obvious reasons, but also that DOE made promises to people throughout New Mexico, specifically along the transportation routes back in the day, that they were going to be able to clean up all the transuranic waste at its 20 sites around the country in 25 years, and then they would close WIP. And WIP was supposed to close March 26th, 2024, with a 10-year closure period to close the site. And that's not happening. And there's an assumption on DOE's part, and I think that we saw that at Buffalo Thunder, an assumption that the colonization can continue without any consultation at all with the people. And I think it's essential that we start talking about that, especially with the amount of money that's coming into the state from DOE. You know, the budget for land was 5.15 billion. It's doubled in the last 5 years, from about 2.7 billion. And so there's so much money, and I don't know the WIP numbers, but Dawn can probably say that. And with Sandia, it's probably the same as the state budget, around $9 or $10 billion. And so there's just the lack of respect and the assumption that it's okay to just continue to do what they're doing is just, I don't have the right word, but it's disrespectful, and they ignore the environmental justice issues. They ignore the consultation and cooperation required. And some days it feels like they just get out their, their D9, their steamroller, and just want to roll over and do what they want to do.
So
Yeah.
I think that's totally true. For people who can, you might want to listen in on the Carlsbad session on Monday, because that will have a different attitude. People, many people, most people, probably all people who will speak there are going to say they like WIP. WIP complies. WIP is a good thing, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not arguing that point. I'm just saying so that people understand there are clearly multiple views, and the Carlsbad meetings is a little different, which again is a reason both for people to listen in, but you virtually will be able to ask questions and make comments there as well.
Mhm.
Okay, John and Arla, we're getting close to the bewitching hour, but we'll keep going as long as people want to go. Go
So
ahead, John.
with regard to what Don, with regard to what you just said, it's my understanding there would be no WIP if it were not for the boosters in Eddy and Lea County who approached the EPA and said, look, we've had a potash mine out operation for decades. We'd love you to consider our county as a site for your big hole in the ground to put nuclear waste. And from there, the federal delegation failed us in that they said, oh yeah, this would be wonderful. And of course, from there, Heinrich said, oh, if you're going to make pits, we sure got to be making them at Los Al. Don't just make them in South Carolina. So the Carlsbad people, I think, are rogue. They have not done us well. And I don't appreciate their bent on saying we've got jobs and tax revenue and restaurants and hotels that get used. So therefore, the whole state should have to suffer under another 50, 60 years of WIP. End of steam blowing.
So the only thing I will slightly correct in terms of what John just said, yes, it was Carlsbad people going to, at the time, it was the Atomic Energy Commission. It was not EPA. It was the predecessor to DOE, and asking them, and a little plug, who's no longer on. One of the people who was on for most of the webinar is Chuck McCutcheon, who was a reporter with the Albuquerque Journal, who wrote the seminal history book about WIP, including the things that John just talked about, called Nuclear Reactions. Chuck actually has gotten the University of New Mexico Press that published the original version to let him know to do a new version. He's physically going to be here next week, and will be at the EPA meetings and other things. So he's certainly somebody that people may want to talk to while he's out here.
And I think it's especially fascinating. Senator Pete Domenici was one of the major boosters of WHIP and really helped push it through when he was a senator in New Mexico. It's kind of fascinating that now his daughter, Nelia, however you say her name, Domenici, is now running, against Senator Heinrich for that seat. So, the familial dynasty goes on, the support WHIP dynasty, which is too bad.
So we had said this was 6 to 8. We can end when we're ready to end. We can go on if some people, I appreciate the fact that so many people, we still have 18 people on who've been on. Most of you have been on for the whole time. So thank you for your interest, participation, and stay with itness. We do appreciate that and encourage people to, as we've said, come to the Santa Fe meetings, come to Carlsbad or Santa Fe virtually online, make written comments. We will give you some sample comments that you can do. I guess the one more thing I was going to say in the slides, but we'll say, if EPA does do what we've asked them to do a rulemaking, as Doug pointed out, there will be some further comment period later after September 16th, later this year, or probably even into next year. So this hopefully is not our last chance to talk to EPA about what they're going to do or not going to do in terms of this particular WHIP expansion request. At this point, when I've asked EPA, and I think what they'll say next week is, we know what the schedule is from September 16th to September 16th, but we don't know for sure what it'll be after that. But hopefully they'll provide a little more detail next week as well.
So to build on what Dawn just said, stay tuned to stopforeverwhip.org and our Facebook page, and stay involved and get our newsletters. And Doug, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all right. I was going to say, we have given the EPA the legal reasoning why it needs to conduct a rulemaking. What we need now is to demonstrate to EPA in human terms, that is, in people showing up and speaking about the issue, that that's what EPA wants to do. We need to make it clear to EPA that that is what the residents of New Mexico want. And I believe we've given them a legal basis on which to do it. Now we need to persuade them that they want to accept that legal basis. So see you next week.
Thank you all. Janet, did you have your hand up? Did you want to say something, or were you waving goodbye?
I was waving goodbye, but also saying, see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you, to Doug, to Dawn, to all of you for being here and being active, and love you guys. See you next week.
Thank you, Robin, too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.